one of my friends was hysterical because she didn't think I was going to make it.
Did anybody question whether it was true or not?
All the time. We're very quick as a society to blame women.
There's that huge perception of like, it's almost your fault that you let it happen to you.
If we don't have evidence, we're wrong. If we have evidence, we're also wrong. Women are more likely to lie. I barely drink now.
We are more scared about what men can do to us.
I didn't want to leave the flat.
Why do you think we gaslight women so much?
Healthcare should be judgment-free, and that's just not what I was given. It would just be so much easier if I jacked all this in and did what was expected of me as a Love Islander. If you're not actively calling it out and not actively being part of the solution, you are part of the problem.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Millennial Mind. Before we start this episode today, I just had to ask you for one tiny favor, because I don't have a big team to market or push this podcast. All I have is you guys pressing that subscribe button, which is free, takes 2 seconds, and helps me get massive guests on the show. I'm so grateful for all your support so far. But wherever you're watching this show, if you could press the follow, like, and subscribe button, it would genuinely mean the world to me. I'm so excited to share this episode with you, so let's get into it. Sharon, hello.
Hi.
Welcome to Millennial Mind.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to get into this conversation today, especially after all the stuff you've just told me.
Oh, yeah.
Just now.
I was saying I haven't been a guest on a podcast in a long time, so it feels really weird to like be in the opposite seat.
Do you prefer it, being a guest or being the host?
I think being a guest because it's less stressful.
It's a difficult one.
Well,
isn't
yeah,
it?
now I have pressure to give great answers, so no pressure for me.
So if people who don't know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself. How would you introduce
Ooh.
yourself?
Okay. I mean, I would introduce myself as a violence against women and girls campaigner, but originally a lot of people probably do recognise me or know my name from Love Island, which is just one of those things now. Seems like such a small chapter from such a long time ago in comparison to everything else. But
So when did you start your campaign against violence against women?
do you know what, actually? I think I've always been in that space from a young age. I was always involved with charities because I used to do beauty pageants when I was a lot younger. So there was always like a philanthropy part of that.
Really? In beauty pageants?
Yeah, there's a massive segment or like massive chunk of it is down to charity work. So I'd worked with cancer charities since 13. I've like done a lot of things with different women's organisations. When I was Miss International UK, I was an ambassador to the Young Women's Trust.
Wow.
To try and get more women on equally paid apprenticeship programs. So when I went on to Love Island, I just felt like a natural transition to like come out and kind of like my goal was to not become an influencer. My goal was to like just have a good time and then go back to work.
Yeah.
So I kind of left, was living that like little party lifestyle, was in that little bubble for a couple of months, and then I was like, oh, okay, well, it's going to get boring very, very quickly. And then that autumn was when the freshers started to talk about, all women that were at university were talking about their experiences with spiking and how some of them were very scared about being in the nighttime economy as university students. And I was like, well, actually, that happened to me last year. So I had to sit down with my publicist and we spoke about whether I want to talk about it because there will be public backlash or there will be people that say it's my fault and you open yourself up to potential judgment from people. And because everyone from Love Island, when they leave the show, is like such under big spotlights from the press, it will kind of blow up. So I felt like I was doing them justice by actually saying this has happened to me too and it can happen to anyone. And it kind of just spiraled from there. It was never intentionally planned to become like this big career change, but it just happened to work and here I am.
So talk to me about that experience. How old were you when you got spiked?
Oh gosh. Okay. I think it was, I'm going to remember 4 years ago now. 4 years? Yeah, 4 years ago now.
How old were you?
So I was 24. So I'm 28 now. And I was out having lunch for my friend's birthday. It was the first weekend that restaurants and things had started to be reopened after lockdown. So naturally, anybody that had been kept inside their homes for such a long time wanted to get out. So we'd booked lunch straight away. And I just remember like nothing was weird, nothing was abnormal. We were having drinks, having food the same way. And I just remember turning around to my friend saying, I don't feel very well. We went upstairs to the bathroom. We went into 2 separate cubicles, which is a little bit strange. And in the first instance anyway, because we always used to go into the same cubicles together. But she came out of hers, didn't see me in the bathroom, just thought, oh, she must have gone back to the table, went back to the table. I wasn't there. She left it 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and she was like, okay, something weird has happened if she's not back, because obviously there was really strict rules about where you could go. If you weren't, you had to be sat at your table because of COVID still being a thing. Yeah, she went back upstairs to the bathroom, and the cubicle that I went into was still locked. So they banged on the door, were calling my name. There was no response. They used like a £1 coin to pick the lock, and tried to open the door, and they couldn't because I was unconscious between the toilet and the cubicle door. So you obviously couldn't open it. The first thing they did was call for an ambulance. And then they said to try and preserve dignity, because I was like partially undressed, or I must have like tried to go to the toilet. I was like, I had my jeans down and I was wearing a bodysuit as well. So that was like, so they got me out and redressed me before the paramedics had come.
Oh my gosh. And do you remember any of it?
I have zero memory from being at the restaurant and waking up in A&E. Nothing else it's just all blank.
So when you say you got spiked, what exactly happened?
So
What
it
did
was.
they find?
This is the thing. They can't. So I had blood tests taken while I was at hospital.
Yeah.
To this day, don't know what they tested me for. Don't know what they found in my system. 2 weeks after I was discharged, I phoned the A&E department to ask for records because I was discharged with nothing. My friends weren't told anything. They promised me they'd send a letter to my GP, which obviously means I automatically get sent a copy. That never happened. So I don't know what they found or if they found anything, but we never went to the police. I never made a report to the police, so they didn't test anything at the hospital from my knowledge or at the venue. But it was a drink that I had, and that was the last thing that I had.
So I know people ask this question. So what's the difference between knowing you got spiked or if you were just too drunk and passed out?
It's usually the way you feel the next day. Like
Right.
a hangover. If anyone's ever taken a recreational drug, you can differentiate between a come down or a hangover. Your
Right.
body feels very, very different. And I had very similar symptoms to what would be considered a come down, and symptoms that aligned with somebody that had GHB in their system. And GHB can be used recreationally. So if you go on like Talk to Frank and things like that, they have symptoms on there, or like, you know, what would happen after you, what can happen to your body during. And everything had kind of aligned with that, as well as friends that I know that have also had experiences of spiking. What they saw of me that day was very similar to what they'd experienced or what they've seen from other people.
What is that?
So it's just the complete loss of control of your body. So when I regained consciousness in A&E, I was covered in blood, vomit, urine, because you lose all control of your body. You lose consciousness. Your breath changes. You know, your heart rate can change depending on like your own body. So, I mean, I'm not a medical professional, but it was my friends that were with me that day had seen me from before I was even old enough to drink to being stupidly drunk on a night out to this. And, you know, one of them was a doctor, and she was like, look, I know this girl's medical record. I've seen what she's like when she's had too much to drink. This is nothing like I've seen it before. And I've heard that one of my friends, well, when I regained consciousness in A&E, one of my friends was hysterical because she didn't think I was going to make it. So, yeah, I just know that what I felt the next day and like the complete loss of memory and like everything else in my body was nothing compared to when I've just been too drunk.
Do you think that the doctors thought that?
I don't know what the doctors thought. I know that the paramedics thought that I was just too drunk. And
that's what I read in an article. They kind of gaslighted you to say you were just too drunk or something.
Yeah, they told my friends that I should just be taken home, and it wasn't that until they put their foot down and were like, I refuse for you to just take her home and dismiss her because look at how she is. And it's the thing that healthcare should be judgment free, and that's just not what I was given. My brother's a healthcare professional, and I asked him, like, you know, how do you feel when you treat somebody that maybe suffers from addiction or something that you don't necessarily believe in? And he was like, that's not for me to make comment on. I'm there to treat the symptoms, not to treat the situation. It's not for anyone in the NHS to say any differently. So, and I think maybe if I was treated differently or my friends were treated differently by these paramedics, we may we might have gone on to make a police report. And that might be the case for a lot of people that have been spiked. If they felt believed in the first point of contact, would they have gone all the way through the criminal justice system, or like even to seek any kind of justice for what had happened to them? Probably.
I think a lot of people in that moment, you know, they probably blame themselves as well. Maybe I just did drink too much, or maybe I wasn't spiked, or something like that. Because like you said, the symptoms are quite similar on the night, the next day that they're not. But so often we gaslight ourselves because we don't want to, you know, make ourselves look bad. And there's a lot of shame as well that's involved in that. Did you have that?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first time actually that I really spoke about it was when I wrote that article for Grazia to say that, you know, this has happened to me too. And my parents found out that it happened to me through the media, because you would hear a story about it online. And not to say that my dad's a bad person, but he'll always be like, oh, well, you know, what did they do? What were they doing? Where were they? What were they wearing? And it's not him as a person. That's just what he's grown up, that society has taught him or taught us, that it must be something that the victim or the survivor has done.
Right.
And
to provoke the situation.
Yeah. And I constantly go through what I do remember of that day, being like, did I wear something? But I didn't. Did I speak to somebody out of turn? Did I do? And I didn't do any of these things. I am the least likely victim that you could possibly think of in all of the list of things that you typically deem as somebody who would get spiked, but it still happened to me. And that's the point that I consistently make to people, is that it can still happen regardless of whether you are the perfect person. And that's why it needs to be taken far more seriously than it ever has been.
Well, I don't think there is a perfect person, because I think that, you know, if you've gone on a night out and you want to wear something that you want to wear, it doesn't make you imperfect. And it doesn't also make you imperfect if you're not wearing heels and you decide, or you're wearing trainers and you're not wearing heels. Do you know what I mean? If you want to wear heels and someone says, oh, well, you shouldn't be wearing heels in a short dress, that's why you got spiked. I just think it's ridiculous. It's not on that person.
But that's the point I make. Like when I say this is what I was wearing, because it has nothing to do with what I was wearing. It has nothing to do with the clothes or the person or where they were. It has everything to do with the perpetrator. And we need to shift focus and talk about them as opposed to talking about me.
So let's talk about the spike, like how often people get spiked in the UK. How common is it?
There's lots of different new ways of being spiked coming out now that I'm hearing more about. And I didn't necessarily do research in the beginning, but I've had people come forward to me about not just drink spiking, but spiking in forms of injection or spiking in forms of vapes, because we know in social settings that sharing a vape is quite common. I actually don't have the knowledge of how, like, if you're being injected, what's in the injection, or if you're being spiked with a vape, I don't actually know what's in it. And it's still, because there's not much conversation about it, the research behind it is really small, which makes it scarier to people that it happens to. But it's one of those things that because I don't know much about it, I don't want to talk about it too much to scaremonger people into not going out and socializing. But you know, you're always told to keep your wits about you, and now it's like, oh, everything and everywhere. But I think that people don't realize that even just putting extra alcohol in somebody's drink, or alcohol in someone's drink that doesn't consent to it, is also considered spiking.
Really?
Because it's the act of putting something in somebody's body without consent. And I think that's why it's so important that new laws, black and white, in clear, plain English, define what it is. So nobody can be like, oh, well, you know, it was only an extra couple of shots of vodka. Like, somebody knows their body, and if this is what they consent to, that's what they consent to. It's not for somebody else to decide.
So I guess kind of like forcing someone as well to have more drinks, and then just saying, I'll just have it, and kind of peer pressuring someone in that way. Is that considered spiking?
If you just go ahead and put it in their drink, even though they said no, then it is considered spiking.
And you can go to prison for that?
Yeah, if they criminally convict you. I don't know if anyone would ever call the police on their friends, but even if you were spiked with alcohol and you called the police, they're just going to tell you that you're too drunk and that there's nothing they can do about it because it's just alcohol.
Is that what happens a lot of the time from the stories that you hear? Is that when people are spiked, they are told that it was just alcohol, it's not a big deal?
Well, every single story, regardless of the age or the gender or any of the demographic of the individual, they've always been told, you're just too drunk, you need to go home, regardless of what they're actually spiked with. I've had anything from people being fully grown men being spiked because people want to rob them, to a 14-year-old girl being spiked with a laxative at a school friend's party. So it's got such a broad, it's quite a broad topic and has lots of different consequences, but the consequences are serious.
When you spoke up about that article, when you wrote it for Grazia, what was the most common thing you were hearing from teenage girls or girls in their 20s about being spiked and their fear about it?
It is, I think for most of them, it was scared of not being believed, or that a lot of the time nighttime economy venues aren't equipped to deal with it. So they'll just see somebody that's like falling over or potentially being sick and just throwing them out into the street. But we know that quite a lot of the time, spiking isn't just the single offence. There's usually a secondary offence that comes with it. So either theft and robbery or sexual offences. So if you leave somebody outside on the street on their own in their most vulnerable state, that's when something more sinister can happen. Like girls, university age students were telling me they were going out with thick coats on, like denim jackets, and they were scared to have like their arms out in case they were going to get jabbed and things like that. But people have sent me pictures of.
What do you mean they're going to get jabbed?
Well, there was a worry about needle injections.
Wouldn't you feel it?
Not if they're really, really small, or you have alcohol in your system, or it's quick. In which case, if you do feel it, it's probably too late. So I mean, I don't know because I've not had a needle injection. But
oh my God, yeah, I feel like I would feel it straight away.
it's easy for us to say that though. But
how would you know you're right? Yeah.
Yeah, until it's
happening
too
to
late,
you.
Yeah.
And how common was that when you were reading those articles?
For me, actually, the stories that I received straight away, needle spiking wasn't as big as drink spiking. I think drink spiking is still probably the most prevalent because it's deemed to be a lot easier to take a drug into a venue to put into somebody's drink as opposed to taking, I don't know how you would conceal a needle to take it into a venue. But there is like conversations about whether venue staff are checking people at doors properly for lots of different reasons when they enter the venue.
There's two things that you mentioned there. One is that you don't know if people will believe you.
Yeah.
And then the second part was the nighttime venues just chucking people out. So I want to start on the whether people will believe you or not. Whether someone has been sexually abused, physically abused, mentally abused, I think the first thing that anybody thinks of is they're not going to believe me. Why do you think women struggle with that?
I think it depends, right? A lot of the time we deem a nice guy, like especially if your partner or the person that's done it to you is deemed as a nice guy, like respectable in every different way, then you're like, oh, well, he's a nice guy. He wouldn't do that to you. It's like when we've seen, unfortunately, cases in the press where a woman has left her partner and he's ended up killing her and her family.
Yes.
And the press call him the nice guy and they show pictures of him in a nice way. Or if the perpetrator is stereotypically somebody you would deem a bad guy, they'll be like, well, it's your fault for choosing to be in that situation. Like you should have taken yourself out of that situation. And I don't think we automatically think about the nuances and the complications around different ways abuse can take place, or the relationship between somebody who's being abused and the abuser. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why we're always like, oh, no one's going to believe me. But also I think we're not ready to have the conversation about how common it is. Because like, well, not everyone can be an abuser, but to an extent, like different levels of abuse means that it can be as common as people are saying it is.
This is so true. I just did a podcast with someone called Anna, and she was telling me that every single one of us is toxic in some way.
Yeah.
We all have toxic traits, and we all can probably be a bit abusive sometimes, whether that's like physically or verbally or mentally or whatever it is. You probably can be at some times, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is all in us to be able to do something unpleasant to somebody else.
Yeah.
And we're not, like, we can't deem the response it's going to, or the trigger it's going to give to somebody else. Because we might think something we say is harmless, but if somebody's experienced something
they might think it's abusive.
Yeah. So we can't control the response from another person when we do something to them.
When you were telling your story and you said that you got spiked, but you were on a night out, did anybody question whether it was true or not?
Oh yeah, all the time. Like whether I'm doing something for press attention, all of this is for media attention or to stay relevant, but nobody wants this to happen to them. And I don't get paid to talk about this. Like this is a lot of hard work just for a bit of attention.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to be abused for attention. Like, you want people to say nice things about you for attention. So I just don't understand like why I would work for free.
And just talk about something, of course.
And care about the well-being of other people, maybe sometimes at the detriment of my own mental health and well-being for a bit of attention.
What were some of those things that the press was saying about you?
It's not necessarily the press. Like, I think I've had a really good relationship with press. I think it's mostly, quite a lot of the time, it's men on the internet.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of the time it is young men online that don't want to believe women, or like, there's a lot of like misogyny influencers going around and conversations about misogyny on the internet, and people believing that you're more likely to be like, women are more likely to lie about these things than actually it being true, or like that you're more likely to be a victim of someone making a false report about you than you are of it happening to you.
Did you watch the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial?
I heard bits about it. I didn't want to watch it because I didn't think that it should be as glamorized
as it was.
As it was.
So I never watched it when it was like live and in action on TikTok, but I watched the Netflix documentary.
Okay, that's on my list.
It was alarming to me because what alarmed me was the fact that it's a really difficult one because I'm not taking sides on whatever's on either person, so don't come at me. What I am going to say though is that everyone was very, very quick to judge her.
Yeah.
And say, well, she's making this up because he didn't physically do this. So for example, she said that he was abusive. Now, she had recorded him being very verbally abusive and smashing things.
Yeah.
Right? For me, that's abusive. Now, she had recorded him and you could tell she was recording him like because he was clearly he was so drunk, he didn't know what he was doing. She recorded him, they played that clip in court, and then everyone blamed her for recording him. Everyone was like, oh, so she can just record him without his permission. And I'm like, hold on here. If I've recorded somebody smashing a wine bottle against the wall, I can't remember what it was exactly, but let's just say, you're going to then blame the other person for recording them instead of actually believing that woman that man could have been abusive. You're never going to have the evidence to show a man punching you in the face unless you have cameras inside your house. You're just never going to have the evidence. But the maximum amount of evidence you can have is him going off on one and maybe like throwing things up in the air, right? And even with that, people were so shocked that she recorded it and blamed her for it. And that made me realize very quickly, just from that small piece, and like I said, it's a 4-part episode, and there's loads of stuff in there, and I don't think she's like the world's loveliest person either. But I felt it was very unjust on her side because it was very much like, oh, well, she's lying.
Yeah. I feel like we're very quick as a society to blame women for a lot of things, and quite a lot of the time for the actions of a small group of men.
100%.
And like, it's not their fault. Like, she must have done something to provoke him, or she was filming him. Of course he was going to be upset. And it's like, well, if we don't have evidence, we're wrong. If we have evidence, we're also wrong. So what exactly is it that you want us to do?
Yeah, exactly. And if you film someone without their permission, you're, what's the word? Manipulative.
Yeah.
If you film someone without permission, you're manipulative. If you film someone while they're doing something horrible, they were just having a bad moment. And I think we're just so quick to tell women that they're wrong about their own feelings. Why do you think we gaslight women so much?
Oh, I honestly don't know. I don't know if it's because from what I've seen online, I think quite a lot of the time we're very good at supporting each other or creating networks to support each other. And I like, I go online and I see like book clubs because women want to do, like, we're very good at being proactive and doing things. If we see a gap and we want something, then we're very good at going out and doing it and making support networks for each other. And I do think that men, for whatever reason, are a bit more afraid to go out and do that and be able to make those in-person connections and meet people in that way, because it's considered like uncool for whatever reason. So then they're kind of falling behind in terms of being able to make those emotional connections with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're just very easily to go and blame women for something that they may be potentially lacking in their own lives. I mean, this is like just from what I'm seeing
course.
online,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe from what I'm experiencing with talking to like male friends. They're like, my friends and I will drive to wherever to go and have hot chocolate and a walk with my friends, but if they aren't socializing in a pub or over a football game, then they don't talk.
So true.
But then they don't talk about, like, everyone, I see these jokes on TikTok all the time, and it's like when your boyfriend gets gossip, but he doesn't know any of the details. And it's because they don't ask each other how they're feeling. They're too afraid to get into the emotional bit. So it's easier to tell a woman that she's wrong, because why would you want to talk about something that we don't want to talk about?
That's so true. And I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there was a therapist, and she was saying that a lot of the things that men come to me and they say, I don't want to talk about this, or I've never told anyone before, are things that women would say very openly on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And I think it's a learned behavior. You know, men are taught to be in a particular way to talk about certain things. I think only now we're giving men that freedom and that permission to be really honest about how they feel. But again, also within the limits.
Yeah.
Because we still now are seeing this notion of like masculine men and feminine women. And masculine men still don't cry. Yeah, they may own their feelings, but they still don't cry. And I think it can be confusing for men because they were taught one thing their whole lives and now they're being taught the other. But then when they are vulnerable and are emotional, you'll get these misogynists online criticizing them.
Yeah.
So they don't know where they stand.
Yeah. I think the same as well. And do you know what, actually, like, maybe people won't agree with me on this, but I actually think male-female friendships are really important. It's really important. What's the word I'm thinking of? Oh, I think the male-female friendship is a really important dynamic, because there's a lot of things that my male friends will come to me and talk to me about that they would never talk to their boys about. Like, I know things, and I'm not as close to these lads as I am to my female friends, but I know things that they would never ever breathe to another human being, that they would rather take to the grave than mention to a male friend.
Why did you say that would be a controversial opinion? Why did you say people don't agree with you?
Oh, because you see so many, like, I don't know if they're like for clickbait or rage bait or whatever people want to call them, but like, you know, when you're like, oh, my man's never allowed to have a female friend, or like, I would never want my woman to be friends with a man for whatever reason. Like, I think platonic friendships between different genders is completely plausible.
I definitely think you can have a male friend if you're a woman, and I definitely think you can have a female friend if you're a man.
Well, I'm bisexual, so that means I wouldn't be able to have friends with anyone.
Yeah, you won't be friends to
me on
yeah.
my own.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it is a really important dynamic, because they feel comfortable to be emotional around me because I'm judgment free and I'm not going to be critical of that, and they feel that with their female friendships. So if you remove that like safety net from them, who can they be emotional to if they don't feel like, you don't want your partner to know everything about you. Not necessarily, like, or you might want to be able to, I don't know what it is, like, keep the spark alive.
Yes.
Or like, there's just some things you don't feel comfortable telling that person, or to the depth of that, because you don't want them to judge you, because you still want them to love you,
So
whatever it is. So that's why you tell your therapist different things that you would tell your partner.
This is really interesting because, again, in this podcast I was listening to, it was about relationships.
Yeah.
And I think we do put a lot of pressure on our partners and our actual relationships, our romantic relationships, to be everything for us.
Yeah.
And that's why we struggle to connect with our friends or our families anymore, because we're just like, our partner is everything. And that's why our divorce rates are so much higher, because we expect so much from this one person, but actually we need to be spreading ourselves out between other people. And so you get men and women who are like, my partner can have 0 friends. There's so much pressure on that relationship to be your friend, to be your partner, to be your soulmate, to be everything. And it breaks apart.
Yeah. I don't want to do that emotional unpaid labor.
Yeah.
For that relationship. Like, I love you, but I want you to have your own life outside of me.
So true.
Because then I can't have my own life outside of you if you're reliant on me for everything. Maybe that's why, like, not a lot of my relationships have worked. But like, I just don't want to have to do the unpaid emotional labor for every single relationship in my life.
This is so interesting. We'll come back to that another day.
Okay.
I wanna talk about what you said, your second point, when you said that the nightlife in wherever in the world is not equipped to handle people who get spiked.
I'm noticing that the current legislation in the UK means that there's no required training for nighttime economy staff to be able to spot the signs of spiking or what to do when somebody's been spiked. Some venues are trained, some chains have more training than others. Some areas have, like, Ask Angela, for example, but it's so different
What's Ask Angela?
If you're on a date or you feel uncomfortable, then you just go to the bar and ask for Angela.
I have seen that.
Yeah. And like some venues have posters in the toilets. I don't know if they have them in the men's, obviously, but it's different everywhere you go. So there's no like uniform blanket that you know that if you go to Wetherspoons or if you go to an independent chain, whether they're both going to have the same process if you need help or you feel uncomfortable.
But do you want there to be the same process? Because let's say now we've talked about Ask Angela and somebody listening to this podcast this guy is being weird with her and she goes to the bar and asks for Angela. Surely he knows the code word.
I feel like quite a lot of people know what Ask Angela is now, but I think that even having a uniform way of all nighttime economy staff or all staff where it could potentially happen to be trained to spot the signs,
right,
is going to be beneficial. So even if not everyone has the same Ask Angela, but everyone knows what to look for or the way to treat somebody that's presenting as either too drunk or spiked with a recreational drug or whatever, like you can keep them safe and look after them as opposed to just being like, well, you're a pain, throw you out.
What are the signs and symptoms of someone being spiked?
It depends entirely on what it is. So with the date rape drug, GHB, it is again like potential unconsciousness, loss of control with your body. I think people that have said to me that you're more likely to be agreeable with things. So you can go with somebody that you wouldn't if you weren't under the influence. Or like if you see somebody like taking someone to a taxi and they don't look okay, but the other person looks absolutely fine, maybe to question like, if you actually even know this person, because quite a lot of the time, well, they won't if they've spiked somebody. But, or if they're spiked with alcohol, they will present as too drunk. That's why it's important to treat symptoms, not the situation, because they might not have volunteered to drink as much as they have.
This is so interesting. And I think such a key point. I think there's lots of places in London now where if you saw someone that was too drunk, you wouldn't feel sympathy for them. You know, you would just be like, well, they're out till 4 a.m. and now they're on the street. I've seen people come out of clubs. I remember once I was on my way to the airport and I saw this guy and he was just flung out of this club and he was bleeding. But obviously I was in the car, so I didn't know what happened. But we don't know if he was drunk. And I think the assumption I've made actually throughout this podcast is that it's only women who get drugged.
Yeah, it's not.
And they get spiked. But it's actually not, is it?
No, quite a lot of the time, well, the stories I've had from men, some are spiked for a reason that's unknown. Some are spiked by their friends because they don't want to take recreational drugs or they don't want to drink, so their friends just top them up or like, oh, this will loosen you up a little bit, so just throw it in there. And some are, from the stories that I've had, spiked for the purposes of theft and robbery. So like I know that it can happen to anyone of any demographic. And I think that's why I found it weird to have backlash for talking about it, because it's like I'm trying to protect everyone, not just myself.
How often do men get spiked?
I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but the stories that I've had are quite small.
Okay.
But I think that they're less likely to want to talk about it, because I think it's common for women to talk about it, or we find it a little bit more comfortable to talk about it with our friends. But I think as a man, they feel even less comfortable talking about it happened to them, because they're supposed to be this big macho figure that can handle anything. And like, how did you let someone spike you?
I was just going to ask you that question. I think there is a perception as well. It's like, how could you let it happen, in the sense that, are you ditzy? Were you not aware? Are you not self-aware enough? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's that huge perception of like, it's almost your fault that you let it happen to you.
Yeah.
Do you get that from people?
Yeah, a lot of the time. Or it's like, she was probably taking drinks from weird men. And like, I've heard that comment from lots of men on the internet when women are talking about it. But there's also like TikToks out there where someone is like, I'm going to put sweet in my friend's drink to show you how easy it is to spike somebody. And if they can put ginormous Swedish fish into someone's drink without someone noticing, imagine how easy it would be to put something that's a lot smaller.
What do you mean, a ginormous Swedish fish?
Like the sweets are probably like the length of my finger.
Oh my gosh.
And they've gone and put it into their friend's drink without them noticing. Just like standing next to you having a conversation and putting it in.
Because you just would never know, yeah.
Yeah, and they've said, oh, if I can do that, like they're saying, it's like a harmless TikTok to
Yeah,
show
yeah,
how
of
easy
course.
it is to like to be able to put something to somebody's drink. And if you can get away with a bright blue sweet in someone's drink, something a lot smaller would be a lot easier to conceal.
How do we prevent that? How do we be more cautious but not be so overly panicked or overly vigilant when we go out?
I think it's hard without putting more onerous onto people that want to just enjoy themselves on a night out. I do think that there needs to be more responsibility on venues.
Mm.
I think that, I mean, how many times have we ever gone to a venue and felt like my bag probably could have been checked a bit better?
All the time.
Yeah. So, you know, people that are concealing stuff, like how often do they get away with being able to bring stuff in the first place? And the care of people. I think it's easier to get a prosecution if we, for example, mine was a drink. I know which drink it was, the last thing I had. I know exactly where the glass was whenever I was last drinking it. Had I been looked after at that moment in time, we could have taken that glass to the police to get prosecution because the drug doesn't leave the glass, it leaves the system.
Oh.
So had I known that, I probably could have got a prosecution or been able to go down the prosecution route if I wanted to. So have we looked after people straight away or wanted to figure out what was happening straight away or made people feel comfortable to tell the police or to tell a paramedic or somebody who can advocate for you? Could we get more prosecutions, which means that it's not seen as a bit of a hidden crime and people can just get away with it?
But also, it's interesting that you said about the prosecution because in your case, there wasn't something that had happened after the spiking, is what you said, right?
Yeah.
So what you said is that spiking is obviously the point one, and then after that, you have like physical, sexual, robbery, theft. In those cases where the second part doesn't happen, how likely are people to get prosecuted?
Less, because the people don't want to tell the police
Why?
because it's one of those things where you're going to get absolutely grilled. They're going to ask you all the same questions about where you were going, what you're wearing, how much you drank, are you sure? And especially if it's left your system quickly, because we know that drugs do leave your system quickly, they're never even going to be able to find it in your system by the time people feel strong enough to be able to come forward. So yeah, every single story that I've ever received, and I've received thousands, not a single one of those people went to the police.
So the stats that we actually have aren't accurate, and people could be getting spiked way more because they just don't report it.
Or that we don't understand what it is and to what extent it can happen.
How did your mental health suffer after you got spiked?
For me, I mean, I consider myself really fortunate that nothing else happened.
Yeah.
And that I had a really good support system and network around me, but I didn't want to leave the flat. I know it was COVID, so people weren't really leaving the flat anyway, but I was still working in central government at the time and I was still going to the office. And I didn't want to go to work. And I was really scared about who was being around me or near me, or like now my behaviours on a night out. The way I barely drink now. And if I do, it has to be in a really confined, contained space or at an event where I feel like I'm completely safe because I don't trust people with my drink.
And then you mentioned you got a lot of backlash speaking out about it. Was this before or after Love Island?
After.
Why did you receive so much backlash?
I just happened to be fresh meat at the time. I think that's part of it. Like when you leave the show, everything you do is always on heat and like everyone has something to say about everything you do, way more than like they do now. So I think that is part of it. And I think it's just because at that moment in time, very few, and public figures are coming out and saying that it's happened to them now, but at that moment in time, I think I was the only one. So I was the one that stuck my head above the parapet. So it was just easy to go for me as opposed to anyone else. And I mean, I had support system at the time. I had a therapist, I had a really good management, I had a really good PR team. So it did bother me. It obviously bothered me. It upset me. But at the same time, I was getting way more nice messages than I was getting horrible messages. And like knowing now what I've been able to do with the messages I've received, all of that is completely irrelevant.
And what do you think the impact of that has been? Because I think a lot of people are so scared to take that first initial step of speaking out about something, but they never realize how many people they're going to help.
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, I knew how prevalent spiking was, but I didn't expect the response to be so big.
Yeah.
And for it to be like pushed back into the media cycle whenever I talk about it, or for like politicians to actually want to be able to sit and listen to me talk about it. I mean, since I spoke about it, GHB got reclassified. So if you're caught in possession, you go from 5-year sentence to a 10-year sentence. That's just in possession alone. I think it's, yeah, 'cause it's
Wow.
class B now. So it went from class C to class B.
What form does that come in? Is it a liquid?
I think it can come in a liquid or a pill form or powder form.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure, but so that might need to be checked. But yeah, like being in possession of that alone carries a more severe sentence. Obviously, the new Labour government pledged in their manifesto they want to make it a standalone crime, and they said in their manifesto and in the King's speech that they want to halve misogyny by the next parliamentary term. So that's part of the big driver. So now, like, yeah, it's completely changed the trajectory of my career and me as a person. And now if anyone says anything to me, I'm like, I've dealt with so much worse. Like, it's just water off a duck's back now.
When you said the government wants half misogyny, what does that mean to you?
I think, firstly, like, actually acknowledging that it's a problem in this country. I feel like for some reason online, it just seems like a massive battle. I was watching a video on my way in of some guest on GB News saying that it's sexist and say that misogyny is a problem and not misandry, when like people still don't want to acknowledge it's a problem and that it's affecting a lot of us. And I feel like as well, like when crimes happen against women, the public are very quiet.
Yes.
Like when we saw that mass stabbing in Australia where the man it was known that he was targeting women and women only. And as soon as like his race was brought up or anything else like that, everybody just went quiet.
Yeah.
Because nobody cared, because it was women he was targeting. That's how it felt to me. So to acknowledge that it's a problem and that they're going to actually like deal with it as a problem and label it for what it is, which to me is terrorism.
Yeah.
Like it's putting a political belief that women are less than onto other people and that we should be able to control them in that way, and they will use violence and force to do so.
Is it true that the younger people get spiked more?
I don't think that's true. I think that's like a weird misconception.
Yeah.
It's usually like young women. I think that younger people now are just more likely to speak up. I think that they're no longer tolerating things that generations before them were tolerating. So they're going to say something. And I think that's why we're hearing more about it than we would our mums or our nans. Because people have told me that spiking's been around since the 80s. And like all of a sudden, people that don't believe that it's a problem are like, well, it's all of a sudden just become a problem. Well, it hasn't. We just are less, we don't want to sit and be quiet anymore because we're sick of this happening to us. So they're going to speak out about it. And I think that's why we're hearing more stories from university age people than from older people.
How did you kind of overcome the trauma from it? Because I can imagine after that's happened to you, like you said, you're fearful right now when you go out. But for people who are like at university or really young, they perhaps go out way more. I mean, I never really go out, and I'm sure you probably don't go out every single week like you do at university. You know, like when you're there, it's kind of difficult to avoid the situation.
Yeah.
How do you help them overcome that fear of ever going out again? Or, you know, also not just being closed, because the experiences that we have when we're younger, they shape who we are today.
Yeah.
So if you've been spiked or something's happened, you might be hypervigilant. And you might actually be really paranoid, and you might actually just always be really anxious when you leave the house.
I don't think that ever goes away.
Really?
Like, to be honest, I think it would always be with you for the rest of your life in some way, shape or form, especially if something like really sinister has ended up happening. But I think that creating that support network for you, like that's what helped me. I'm in a very fortunate position where I had a therapist and I had,
of course.
so like I know that whatever I say is going to be kind of out of touch to like a university person, like student, but my friends were still like in that first instance the number one thing to me and the thing that helped me get through it. And I think if you are anxious about going out, you need to be able to talk about it to the people you're going out with. And I think that is one thing that I've noticed that girls will always do better than boys, is like if our friend wanders off, we're not just going to carry on.
Yes.
Like we're like, where is our friend? Whereas I've noticed with like maybe it's lads that I know, like if their mate wanders off, they're like, oh, they'll be back. And I'm like, well, no, do you not care about your friend's safety and where your friend is? And I think that, you know, having those conversations, like if someone's worried, or coming up like with a game plan is what I used to call it. Like, this is our plan for the night. That's how it helped me feel better about going out again. And it's annoying because every single solution that anyone can ever come up with is putting more onerous on people when they go out. And unfortunately, that's all I can really give, because unless people just stop doing horrible stuff to other people, you kind of don't really have anything else to give.
The interesting thing that you just mentioned was the game plan. And I think in hindsight, it can seem so obvious to have one. So I know that, when my brother's gone out with his friends and one of them's wandered off, and if something's happened the next day, we're like, why did you leave them? Or like, what's happened? And they're like, I don't know. But I think with women, we are more scared about what men can do to us.
Yeah.
And so we do have more game plans. Whilst men are not scared what women can do to them, they're probably scared what men can do to them. But I think none of them are probably scared about how women can do something that's going to harm them potentially.
I just think that maybe it's a way that we've been socialized or brought up that women are automatically made to like be more cautious than men are. I mean, I've made jokes about it to my male friends a lot. Like, they always do really stupid stuff. And I'm like, this is why women live longer, because we're more cautious about stuff.
We are more cautious, yeah. But I think we've been trained to be more cautious, but we've had to be more cautious as well. It's so interesting, like when we're in the back of a car and I feel a bit uncertain, I will always put the keys in between my fingers. And it's such a normal thing that I do. I didn't even realize that I did it. But my partner the other day noticed I did it, and he was like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, I didn't even know that I did that. It's just I felt a bit scared by the driver.
Yeah.
So I just got ready. But it was such an automatic response that he didn't understand what was going on. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was so interesting because I think that the more that you talk about it, you will always get some pushback. Like on TikTok, I spoke about the fact that I was walking home one day and this guy that was walking on the parallel, like the opposite side of the street, we were walking in parallel, and he crossed over on the other side because he was behind me. And then when I crossed over, because I saw some more men on my side, he crossed back over. As he crossed back over, he said, just wanted to let you know I didn't want you to think I was following you, so I'm going to cross the street again. And I was like, what an amazing person.
Yeah.
I shared the story on TikTok. You would think that people are going to be nice about it.
No, they'd be like, why should he cross the street?
Why should I zigzag across the road? Why are you making a big deal out of nothing? Why did you make the story up? I'm like, sorry, why would I make the story up to say that? Thank you so much for men like this in the world. Like, why would I do that? And it's just so easy for people to always poke a hole in the narrative that you're trying to share.
I think
that's why people don't speak about them being abused or anything.
I also think with people like that they don't think they're part of the problem because they haven't physically done something to somebody.
Yes.
But if you are not condemning things or actively speaking out against, or like looking to do things to make people feel more comfortable, you are part of the problem. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And the man that chose to cross the road to make you feel more comfortable was part of the solution, because he's actively decided that not all men is real because I'm going to actively be different. But they just think because you haven't physically assaulted somebody that you're not part of the problem,
100%.
when actually that's not true. And we know that men will listen to their male peers a lot more than they will to anyone else. So if you call out their behaviour and be like, mate, you shouldn't really do that, your friend's more likely to be like, oh, actually, yeah, you're right, I shouldn't do that, than they would if they catcalled a woman in the street and she was like, don't do that. So we know that if you're not actively calling it out and not actively being part of the solution, you are part of the problem. That's just how I see it.
When you said that you speak to a lot of male friends about this, and obviously you get stories that come in about men, what's the thing that they struggle with the most when it comes to that communication?
Do you mean communication with each other?
Yeah.
I think I don't know if it's a small town thing or if it's just ingrained into us since we were children that you don't want to be different, because if you're different, you stick out and people are more likely to like notice that. But I think they're waiting for someone to put their head above the parapet first. And like putting their head out first and being like, I'm not okay, or I want to talk about this. Because then once one of you does it, then you'll all feel comfortable to do it. But they just don't, I don't know if it's just them as a group that they just don't want to stick out first and be different first because they're scared to have the mickey taken out of them.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, with misogyny growing so much, especially in the UK, it's very easy for people to be like, oh, I saw a reel the other day when a man was doing all this stuff for this woman. And people were like, oh my God, men have just become women these days. And I think this narrative as well that we're seeing online of like, oh, men have just become women, it doesn't help people to be authentically themselves either.
But it was also like that's internalized misogyny as well, by saying that women are weaker. So if a man decides to show his emotions, you must be female or feminine because you're acting like a woman. Well, that's like you're internalizing misogyny as well. So you're actually not doing anyone any justice, regardless of anyone. I think that's down to the patriarchal structure.
That is such a true point. Define misogyny for me, because I think people define it in very different ways. What's your definition of it?
My definition is that it's an ideology that women are lesser than you. And I don't think that, to me, misogyny isn't someone that just actively takes action on that ideology. For me, it's somebody that manifests it in any way, shape or form.
In what way?
So like if you just automatically think that there's going to be someone that's going to come through on the online being like, oh, biologically women are weaker than men. But like, if you think that, I know, when there's so many men that I could arm wrestle and beat, like I'm not going to do it. But I think it's actively thinking that they are like women are lesser than you and going about your day-to-day business acting like that, as if like looking down upon women, or like getting freaked out if a woman talks about a period, or if a woman's on her period, she was like, I just need to take 5 minutes, and they're like, oh, weak. Like, it's just, there's lots of different microaggressions that you can carry towards women, and that's what I deem as misogyny.
Have you experienced that?
Oh yeah, all the time. I used to work in Westminster. It's pretty prevalent, I think. But I think it's...
Talk to me about that.
I think it's just... I think that because people are more talking about it now, you're kind of picking up on it. But I think that, if you say... for example, there was a story, and I don't know whether it's true, whether just the press made it up for lols, but when I went into Love Island, there was articles about how I was deemed less good at my job because I took my legally acquired annual leave to participate in a beauty pageant, but you wouldn't criticize a man who would use his legally acquired annual leave for a golfing holiday. I'm within my legal rights to take that annual leave because the law says so. What I choose to do with that time is nobody else's business but my own.
That is so true. Wow.
And I saw the article and I was like, I don't care, but whatever.
That happens all the time. Actually, on another podcast, this is not irrelevant, but different example. This doctor was telling me that if her husband takes time off work because he's broken his leg, it's totally fine. But if a woman takes time off work because she's got really bad period cramps and she's suffering with endometriosis, it's like, do you really have to take time off?
Yeah, because it's deemed as a lesser issue.
But endometriosis can be like twice as painful as breaking your leg.
Yeah, but
it's so interesting. But there's not enough research to prove anything because we don't invest in women's health.
Yeah.
Which is, so like they can't even say, oh, this is the research to show all of this information. We have some, but we don't have detailed research, which is so interesting compared to physical, like breaking your leg or having a headache or something like that.
There's just so many things that I joined, like the Olympics had just happened and women's football was a massive topic of conversation. I joined a webinar that was about journalists talking about women's sports. And like, I didn't even know there were so many things like how football boots are only shaped to men's feet, not to women's feet, or like shin pads are made for men, or like the grounds that they train on are so hard, so women are more likely to have non-contact ACL injuries, or like nutrition is geared to men, so we don't focus on the menstrual cycle when it comes to women's athletes. I hope that changes because we saw some mad representation in the Olympics, like pregnant women competing and all sorts. So
that's amazing.
I hope that changes, but yeah, we're just all these little things when I'm constantly sick of hearing about how women's football is nowhere near as good as men's football. And it's like, we do not put anywhere near as much investment into female athletes as we do into male athletes, when there's so much money, like so many more complications to deal with when it comes to a female athlete's body. But that's completely different.
Topic for another day.
You might need another 45 minutes for something like that.
With the work that you've been doing, what's the biggest growth lesson you've learned for your own personal development?
I think for my own personal, I've always been one of those people that's like, only you know if you're on the right path and what you're doing is right. And I think that there were so many times where I was like, it would just be so much easier if I jacked all this in and did what was expected of me as a Love Islander.
Yeah.
But now that I'm seeing like the fruits of my labor, which is just not the right turn of phrase, but like the fruits of my labor actually like coming to fruition, and seeing people talking about it and seeing people taking it seriously, and like seeing changes in law coming into place, like just know that like I have to trust my gut instinct to myself and not doubt myself, and like not consider myself an imposter in a room when I'm invited there, because I had to work 10 times harder to be there than somebody else, because I'm Asian, because I'm bisexual, because I came on reality TV, because like of all these different things, I had to work 10 times harder than some of those people just to be in that room. So to just stop thinking that, like not to trust my gut instinct when I'm doing these things.
I love that. And what's the number one quote you live by?
I'm a seek forgiveness, not permission type person.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, talk to me about that. I'm the opposite.
I just do things, and if it doesn't work out, then I just hold my hands up to it and say like, oh, I'm sorry, it doesn't work out. But yeah, I just think
You'll always try.
You should just go for something, and then if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Like, you're going to regret more. Obviously, there is context needed to that,
Yes.
but I think that going ahead and doing things and having to like say, oh, sorry, that didn't work out, and then just changing direction is better than asking somebody for permission to do something, because that will always put the seed of doubt into your mind, so you never go and do that thing.
So true. I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing so vulnerably about your story. And I know it's going to help so many other people there today feel heard and seen and validated in their experience. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.